Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being.
Welcome to the 250th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And the theme for this month is all about why the pushback. Before we start though, have you watched my TEDx talk? It's about the connection between culture, race and mental health in the workplace. It's something you can watch in your break as it's just 12 minutes long. And the link is of course in the show notes, but I'll give it to you here. It is bit.ly/TEDx Wolves, WOLVESLO. And I really hope you enjoy it as it was a labor of love. And if you did, please leave a positive comment on YouTube, share and like. Also, don't forget to connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter. So if you listened to the podcast last week, I introduced this topic of pushback and what it is. Pertinent, there's been so much of it towards equality, diversity, inclusion and mental well-being over the last 4 years. Plus, in my experience last week, I have definitely experienced some pushback, which has spurred me on to make this episode about, do we have to do this training? Over the years, I've really wavered about this concept of mandatory training. That's to say, when I was the head of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Centre at Imperial College London, I was really desperate for all our training to be mandatory, and I would fight for it. And I remember the then head of the Learning and Development team would say to me, Layla, I don't know if that is actually what you want. So now I've come around to his way of thinking. I'm actually not so sure. Being the facilitator, full-time facilitator is one of the many things I do. As always, let's start with some definitions because there is a difference between mandatory and statutory training. And I want to point out a really great resource that I've taken these definitions from, and it is the Mandatory Training Company. So mandatorytraining.co.uk/blogs, statutory versus mandatory training. What is the difference? And that link is in the show notes. So statutory training is required to ensure that the organisation meets its legislative duties. Mandatory training is an organisational requirement to limit risk and maintain safe working practices. So let's look at these in a bit more detail. So statutory training is where a statutory body has mandated that organisations provide that training based on specific legislation. So the most common in the UK is, of course, under the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 and the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999. So the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 is an act of Parliament in the UK that as of 2011 defines the fundamental structure and authority for the encouragement, regulation and enforcement of workplace health, safety and welfare within the UK. So therefore, adherence to the Act is essential for employers and employees to maintain a safe and healthy working environment. So some examples of that will be awareness, but training and often online about health and safety. We often get fire safety is a really important part of that. If organizations are using substances hazardous to health, you will do COSH. And if you've ever worked in a lab, you know we have COSH cards. How to report injuries, diseases and dangerous occurrences. So RIDOR and RIDOR systems can be online. Manual handling and basic risk assessment training are some examples. Now, mandatory training is compulsory training, so it's not in legislation, but it is training that an organisation determines as essential for its safe and efficient delivery of services. Mandatory training helps to reduce organisational risks and comply with legislation, but it isn't enshrined in legislation itself necessarily, but of course it helps compliance with that. Regulations and guidance. Mandatory training also helps employees to complete their jobs safely and efficiently. So there's been a lot of, I guess in some ways I want to say nonsense, but you'll hear it in certain strands of particular media where they say, oh, you know, employers are making everyone do unconscious bias training and it's mandatory and you can say no. And so that's the thing, but it's deemed compulsory for particular organizations and very rarely is it mandatory because it's about safe and efficient delivery of services or looking at service delivery, whether that's in a public or private sector context, to be improved in a particular way. But some other examples of mandatory training that people don't tend to complain about as much. Child protection, could be complaints handling, conflict resolution. It could be around managing difficult customers, including violence and aggression in the workplace, especially for frontline staff and public sector services. It could be infection prevention and control. Also first aid, you know, you don't have to do first aid, but organizations have to have a certain number of first aiders, but it's not statutory for everyone to be a first aider. So that's an interesting example. Mental health first aid as well, because if we think about many organizations will decide that that's really important. But I think the key thing is it will depend. So this is why for some organizations, kind of mental well-being and equity, diversity, and inclusion training will be mandatory, and for others it won't be, even if it's in the same sector, because they will also be shaped by the local risks that an organization has deemed, what are the risks? So often with mandatory training, as I'm sure you'll be aware as listeners, is that something hasn't been mandatory. So we'll ignore the statutory health and safety piece, but let's say it's something around conflict resolution. And then there's a number of bullying cases, and it might escalate and it might go to an employment tribunal. And then often what you find, it'll suddenly become mandatory, or there'll be some course on it because it might have been deemed that this is what the organization has to do. Or before it gets to that point, an organization might say, okay, we better get on this because it's going to hit the press or something's going to happen. But do check out that blog. I think it was really helpful in explaining that. Now, I do understand why mandatory training, the word mandatory training as well, it's just not great, as opposed to upskill training or, supporting your professional journey training. It does have a different nuance to it, doesn't it? Can feel quite blah. And the other element is that people often have terrible experiences. They go to this training, it's boring. The particular trainer might just be getting through the material. They might have a certain style that grates on people. Many people have had very difficult experiences, particularly if we look at older generations, my generation and above, of having a really bad time at school. It could be that they are identified as neurodivergent, or they don't know they have neurodivergence. And so sitting in a classroom environment, which these trainings often are, can feel really horrible and takes them back to a place that could be subconsciously, unconsciously, or completely consciously. But if we're serious, if any organization is serious about doing this well, it's important to have basic things in place. And we know the phrase, a stitch in time saves nine. And it really does here, because it reduces the risk of employment tribunals really coming down hard. Because one of the first questions that are asked, particularly I know in cases where it's around disability discrimination, because I've been subject to several subject access requests when I had a proper job. It was about how, what was the training, what was the support given to the manager, and also of course the disabled member of staff. So there's that side of it, and I think it's also part of creating this professional workplace communities. So organizations that fail to provide their staff with necessary statutory and mandatory training may face various regulatory and legislative implications. So for example, under the Health and Safety Act 1974, employers are required to protect the health, safety and welfare of their employees and others affected by their business. So that's really important. And I think if we look at health, safety, psychological risk, mental well-being, then you can start to see, okay, well, we need to think about this in a really broad way. And in the case of either mandatory continuing professional development or a qualification training that's required for an employee to hold a position, it is actually reasonable for an employer to require an employee to undertake training. However, an employer may also require an employee to participate in other types of training as deemed necessary to meet the demands of the job or the organization, or any new legislation even pre-legislation, sort of often, particularly with maybe NHS trusts, they have an inkling of something. They'll try and get their staff to do the training to meet the demands of what could be coming up. So this could be related to new systems, new work equipment, or, new working policies, etc. So often if there's a new bereavement policy, sometimes you'll get HR trainings, senior managers and middle managers, so they know what's coming up. That's one example. Also, it depends on the sector that you're in. Of course, certain sectors have to do this all the time. Mentioned hazardous substances, people working in particular situations, doctors, legal practices. There's so much to it. So I really hope you're enjoying the content of this podcast and you want to keep up to date. If so, then why not join my newsletter? When you join my mailing list, you'll receive a copy of my white paper on inclusive language and mental health. And that link is bit.ly/ILMHCK. Right. So it's all very well saying this. I'm still on the side. I think you can tell from my voice and the way I've talked about this, is that I do feel that it is important, but I think we can't just roll out poor level training, or we can't just expect people to sit and click. And in fact, when I was doing research on this, it's amazing what you find, isn't it? If you type into Google mandatory training, one of the things that comes up is, how can I just click through all the videos to get through the mandatory training? And that's not really what we want people to do. So in reality, there is pushback, even if and when the training is valuable, interesting, and useful, both inside a role and outside. And in theory, I think it would be great for well-being, mental health, anti-racism, and managing conflict, amongst others, to be essential. But problems really arise when delegates don't want to be there as a result of this mandate. And this is definitely what I experienced last week in all its glory. So this is often what happens when you make training mandatory and the delegates don't want to be there. These are just some examples. They come into sessions 30 minutes late and disrupt at least, or they come in late. They were talking in smaller groups very noisily in a plenary feedback session, so I couldn't hear other people, or other people can't be heard. There were constant chatter and side conversations. Really inappropriate jokes and banter constantly and consistently. And in fact, one delegate, we were watching a video, an example of some good practice. And they said, they were really engaged, but they said, oh, those two birds. And I was like, wow, this is interesting. I feel like I'm at school in the 90s again, instead of saying, there's two women, one woman did this. He did apologize. But again, it was the culture of that team, which was quite interesting. Don't absorb the content and blank it all out. So if you ask a question about, okay, when we did this bit, what was the result? What do people remember? They couldn't remember anything. Now, that could be, of course, related to the way in which people process, but the fact that the whole room was like this was a real red flag for me. They prevent others from learning and say, this is really boring. I don't want to do this. They don't do the tasks, refuse to carry out the training tasks assigned, or do the tasks they think they want to do, and keep asking what time the session finishes. And that's actually very demoralizing and exhausting as a trainer, that you just think, oh, well, what's the point? So I think both feed off each other. Now, I'm not saying facilitators and trainers don't have responsibility, but I do think if you commission training, it's worth asking yourself, maybe prior to deciding what is mandatory. So statutory, we know we have to do, it's enshrined in law, but we can also think about what's the best way to deliver this. But with any training, particularly mandatory or optional training, it's important thinking about what's the ultimate goal of this training. If and when staff are trained, how will that move us towards our aims and missions? How will upskilling make a difference to the staff experience? And then how can we run an effective pilot? Because again, what happens is often when there's an incident or something's happened, it's like, right, everyone in, we've got to do this, and we've got to do it now, we've got to do it in the next 3 months. And sometimes that does happen if you've been given as part of an employment tribunal or part of a verdict, you have to do it quickly. But I think the issue with that is then, if you don't have time to run a pilot, and sometimes you don't, it's like, oh, we all have to do this and we're so busy, and another thing on our plate. Whereas actually, we think about things that we might be thinking about making mandatory, or that are not mandatory or optional. We can run an effective pilot, or run a pilot, get a buzz going around the issue, get some feedback, really feedback, and then do a bit of an iterative process. Now, we can't always do that with all training, because some training is very prescriptive, particularly if it's a licensed product like Mental Health First Aid England, or Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland. Indeed, if anyone has done NEBOSH training, there's a particular process to it. You can't just say, oh, we're going to do that. But I think that you could think about delivery styles, what would work. Could some things be delivered in a non-classroom environment? So things like that. And then who will be an ambassador for this area of work or this particular training once they're trained, and how are they going to get people excited about it? And I think you also have to, within an organization, especially if you have a lead for training and you need to get your allies on, is give people a briefing of what to expect. So we're going to be rolling out this training. We've done a pilot. If you have, these were the results. This is how we responded to it. This is what you're going to do. This is what to expect. You are going to be in a classroom format. If you can split it up, if you can do walk and talk elements or anything that people can do outside, I think that really helps. Can you split the training into smaller sessions? So people really don't like whole day sessions anymore, I've noticed. So pre-COVID, it was possible. It was still 3 hours. Now people can't bear it. They just want 90 minutes, 90 minutes, 90 minutes. Now, you'll have heard me say this before. You cannot go from not knowing anything or having a basic understanding to being an expert in 90 minutes. We do not learn to write as children and the next day publish a best-selling adult or even children's novel. So we can't do it. We know it's a process. And actually, if we think about our writing and different styles of writing as adults, so we've got business writing, we've got emails, we've got creative writing. Particularly with creative writing, do you ever really arrive? It's a journey, and you train yourself and you keep going. So even though we're not talking about that, I think it's really useful to think about the point that you're not going to be an expert, but can you chunk things up? And also, what might you like to do between those sessions to help people? Because now memory and retention is a huge issue with everything that we've going on in the day to day. I think it's also important to highlight the benefits in terms of career progression. Now, that's not always possible, but we also have to accept the fact that maybe people aren't going to stay. But what about career progression? And they might go away and then come back again because they've been able to get a more senior role somewhere else, and then come back when there's a even more senior role advertised at the initial organization. And I think also when you do the briefing on training, it's really important to explain professional training etiquette. So most facilitators and trainers will do group agreements and ground rules before starting. But to say that, this is an opportunity, this is how to behave, not for everyone, but I can tell you there's certain areas within large organizations, because they don't tend to have classroom training as regularly as, let's say, professional services staff or desk-based staff. They don't often know how to behave, and the nervousness can come out in these jokes and banter, making it kind of uncomfortable, and it feels very much like school, and it feels very childish, and that does not link to the whole professional workplace environment. I think it's also a mix of reward and highlighting the risks. So the risks could be around criminality when not attending training, but as an organization, here are some examples of organizations that didn't do it right, court cases. I don't think lead with that. I'm not saying that. Let's highlight the rewards, and the rewards around professional development, maybe meeting new people in an organization, having some time out of your day-to-day job. That's a real winner for some people, career progression. And then, weaving in these other elements if there's still resistance. And then if you've got your ambassadors to really create a buzz, I think that's better than highlighting risks, but there is a place for highlighting those risks. And also make sure that your trainer or the facilitator is right for your audience and your people and your culture. The example was a very large brick manufacturer called me, and we had a really great conversation, and they wanted something around mental health on the factory floor, so manufacturing these bricks. And I had a chat to them, and I said, you know what, obviously you really know what you're looking for. I don't think I'm the person to deliver that. So I could definitely deliver the content, but whether the group of people that you want to take things on board are going to take things on board for me, I don't think so. I do actually think they need a male trainer to hear, and they probably need a male trainer who's worked in a kind of physical role, and that really isn't me, because what do I know? I don't know about working, doing hard labor on a factory floor and being a 55-year-old white British man. So I think as well, a good trainer should say, what's the culture? This is my background, the organizational culture. This is my background in terms of my experience of work. Actually, I'm probably not the best person, and here are some people who could be useful. But if you want any input into the content, let me know. So I think that that's a really important thing as well, because I think if I had delivered that, it would have gone down like a lead balloon, if I'm honest. But please do get in touch with me to find out more about how I could help you at Leyla, Leyla at diverseminds, all one word.co.uk. I can support you with keynotes, workshops, or team coaching sessions, and also supporting equality, diversity, inclusion, and learning and development practitioners on managing pushback. So remember, there is a difference between statutory and mandatory training. It's vital to provide statutory training and also to decide what's mandatory and what's continuing professional development best practice for your organization, which will of course be governed by the work and the sector. Can it be moved from blah to yeah? And people may need time to come to terms with what's mandatory and how it will benefit them. So spend some time in that planning and communication before just rolling out and pushing people into it. So I really hope you've enjoyed this show. And if not, please write me a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast from. And don't forget, I love to hear from you as listeners. And to make this super easy, I've created a place online where you can leave me a voice note anonymously called SpeakPipe. Or, of course, you can leave your name if you choose. The link is in the show notes, and I'll give it to you here. It is bit.ly/SPKPDMP. And the resources for this episode are mandatorytraining.co.uk, their blog on statutory versus mandatory training and what's the difference. So please join me again in the next episode, where we're going to be talking more about the theme, why the pushback. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.